Hi everyone! For this video, I wanted to talk about my secret approach to learning watercolor, which has been working really well for me so far. I thought it might be helpful for those who are learning watercolors to hear from someone who's learning too. In my last video, I mentioned how I've always wanted to paint with watercolors, but it never quite worked, and I kept intimidating myself out of it. If you're in that kind of situation where you're immediately telling yourself there's no way I can do that, check out my video about getting out of my own way. I was there too. Well, after about a bit over a month of painting nearly every day, I'm at a point where I'm finally starting to get a hang of watercolor. After years of not getting anywhere, I'm finally getting somewhere. The reasons why my attempts before this didn't get very far was partly mental, as we discussed last time, but part of it is that watercolors are hard. Especially for me, because I mostly worked with dry media, like pencils before this. And maybe for others, it wasn't as confusing to learn, but I definitely struggled. From how I see it, there's a level of control you don't always have with watercolor. I was used to media that did exactly what you wanted, but watercolor, sometimes physics takes over and you just have to know how and why it happens so you can use it to your advantage. There are so many factors involved somehow, and it pretzeled my brain every time. I ended up learning how to paint oils, gouache, and acrylic before I could manage watercolors, even though it was one of the first types of paints I had access to. I watched plenty of YouTube videos, dug up memories of my high school art teacher teaching us some tricks with watercolors, but it didn't help that much. It was getting too far ahead. I knew about ways to produce different effects, but not what to do with just basic watercolor paints and water. What I needed was practice, but you guys are probably like, duh, that's a given. Don't worry, it's not the secret I mentioned earlier. What helped me the most at getting focused practice was actually switching to colored inks. It might sound counterintuitive, but hear me out. Colored inks also have their own quirks, but otherwise they're pretty similar to watercolors except for one major thing. They're permanent when dry. You know why that's great? Well, let's back up. I mentioned earlier that watercolors involve many factors. There's the amount of water mixed with the paint, the amount of water on the paper itself, your brush, the fact that watercolors reactivate when wet, color mixing and color properties, and where and how you make your marks. There are probably even more factors that I'm just not thinking of right now. For me, personally, controlling the balance of water and paint was really difficult to get a hang of. I had done some of my 2019 Inktober pieces with watercolor, and half the time I put way too much water down and it would puddle, or I'd try to layer and get blooms because I reactivated what was there already, or the paints I put down were so diluted that I had to layer more, but again that fed back into the blooming problem. It was a mess. That's why it was really helpful for me to start with colored inks this time, because it took out one of those factors. I could layer without messing up the previous marks, so I could actually focus on getting a hang of controlling the water. It was even more pertinent for colored inks because of the permanence and how quickly they dry. You're probably like, big deal, it gets rid of one factor. But if you think about it, controlling the amount of water is half of it. I mean, watercolors, it's in the name. It's a fine balance between too much and too little water, and when it's such a struggle to keep the painting clean and preventing unwanted blooming, it's really hard to let loose and actually have fun. At least in my opinion. Which is another important thing. Having fun makes you want to paint more and keep coming back, which helps you get that practice in without feeling like you're being forced. It's important for maintaining your motivation to put in the work because it won't feel like work. For example, the piece I did for Independence Day was purely having fun with the colored inks. Even if the outcome isn't perfect, it's important to allow yourself that freedom to explore and have fun. I think colored inks lend themselves to this really well. It's also helpful that colored inks are limited in color. You can mix them to get more, but a limited palette also helps you from getting overwhelmed by choices. Again, it was taking out more factors. They're also very easy to get the exact dilution every time because they're in liquid form, and you can use a dropper for the paint. A lot of the bottles come with the dropper. I also chose to use a pipette for my water to be exact as well. That makes it so that you have to think even less about actually getting your workspace set up, your colors set up, so that you can actually paint. When choosing your few colors, choose colors that allow you to mix more when you get to that point, like maybe primary colors or something. But be sure to pick colors that you tend to use a lot, or just even colors you like. The point is to encourage yourself to paint. It's not about having every color under the rainbow if you might not even use them. I also want to mention that there are different types of colored inks. Not all of them are permanent, so it's important to make sure you get the right kind if you decide you want to try them out. I used acrylic inks, which are pigment based. I could probably make a future video about my supplies, but I've also heard of colored India inks, which are also permanent. I definitely want to try those out at some point too. This piece here is my first one in watercolor after a month of colored inks. I could feel a huge difference in how I was controlling them this time. Still not a pro by any means, but I finally felt more comfortable with it. I was actually having fun with this one. Watercolors also don't dry as quickly as colored inks, so it actually felt easier. Isn't that crazy? It's like Goku training with weights, so he was extra strong. That's how it felt. My time with colored inks taught me to get the right dilution of color and water before putting it on the paper, doing tests on a different paper, controlling moisture in my brush with a towel, getting a hang for seeing the level of moisture in my brush. Basically, a lot of skills that directly translate to watercolors. This method might not work for everyone, depending on what exactly you're struggling with when it comes to watercolors, but it helped me immensely. I love watercolor and colored inks now. I even use both sometimes. Like I said, they each have their own quirks and advantages. I love colored inks because of their vibrant colors and permanence. I like watercolors because they tend to be more textured, there are more colors available, and they stay wet longer so they blend more easily. I can finally start using them without using as much brain power, which allows me to zone out a bit more. It's great! I hope that this tip might help you get there too. If anything, colored inks are super fun anyways. Watercolors used to be something I had resigned myself to not being my thing or something I'd ever be good at. But once I got out of my own way, got myself those colored inks to practice with, I began to feel hopeful that I can get there someday. I've still got a long way to go. I've seen the amazing sort of things other artists have done with watercolors, and I still have yet to figure that out, but I look forward to it. I hope it was helpful to hear from one beginner to another. I know it's hard, but don't give up. I believe in you. Thanks for watching my video. If you liked it, please be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps me out and could help others find the video too. If you like my art, you can also follow me on Instagram. I also have a Patreon where I share more about my artist journey, my thought processes, as well as exclusive content I don't post anywhere else. The links to all that are in the description below. Does anyone else have any tips of their own or things that worked well for them? Please share them in the comments. I'm definitely still learning and would love to learn from you and your experiences, or even just to share the struggle of learning something new. Dare to do what your heart desires and have fun. Bye everyone!